The job offer seemed too good to be true. A private nursing position in a luxurious mansion, an unbelievably high salary, and just one patient. A millionaire in a vegetative state. It was the kind of opportunity that could change someone's life overnight. And for Emily Carter, a dedicated nurse struggling with bills and an exhausting hospital job, it felt like fate had finally thrown her a lifeline. When she arrived at the estate, she couldn't help but feel intimidated. The mansion was enormous, standing alone at the end of a long tree-lined driveway. It had the kind of silence that made you feel like someone, or something, was always watching. The air smelled of expensive cologne and old wood, and the chandeliers hanging from the ceilings sparkled under the dim lighting. Everything screamed wealth and power. But there was something else too, a strange, heavy atmosphere, as if the walls carried secrets they couldn't speak. Emily was greeted by Mrs. Holloway, the millionaire's wife. She was elegant but cold, her sharp blue eyes scanning Emily, as if measuring her worth in an instant. "You're the new nurse," she said, more of a statement than a question. Her voice was smooth, controlled, and unreadable. "Yes, ma'am," Emily replied, clutching the strap of her bag. "I was told your husband needs full-time care." Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Follow me." As they walked through the long hallway, Emily couldn't help but notice the family portraits on the walls. Smiling faces, luxurious vacations, a picture-perfect life. But something was off. In some of the pictures, the millionaire, Mr. Holloway, looked different, healthier, livelier. But in the most recent ones, even before he had fallen into his current state, his face had changed. He looked afraid. They entered a dimly lit room at the far end of the hall. The air inside was cold, even colder than the rest of the house. And there he was, James Holloway, once a powerful businessman, now lying motionless in an elaborate bed, surrounded by expensive medical equipment. His eyes were open but lifeless, staring at the ceiling as if trapped in a world beyond reach. His breathing was steady, controlled by machines that hummed softly in the background. Emily had seen many patients in critical conditions before, but something about this man unsettled her. His face, though still and emotionless, held a shadow of something unspoken, like he was trying to tell a story, but couldn't. "You'll be the only one caring for him," Mrs. Holloway said. The previous nurse left. Unexpectedly, Emily frowned. Left? The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't the right fit. There was something in the way she said it that made Emily's stomach tighten. But she nodded, forcing a professional smile. "I understand. I'll do my best." As she settled into her role, Emily quickly realized that life in the mansion was far from normal. The staff rarely spoke, avoiding eye contact as they hurried through their duties. The family, Mrs. Holloway, their son Ethan, and their teenage daughter Claire, kept their distance. And then there was Mr. Holloway himself. At night, when the house was eerily quiet, she sometimes felt like his eyes were following her. Of course, it was impossible. His condition left him incapable of movement or speech, and yet there were moments when she swore she saw something in his expression shift, as if he was aware, as if he was trying to communicate. Then, strange things started happening. Medical equipment beeping at random times. The lights flickering in his room when no one else was there. A feeling, an unshakable feeling, that someone was always watching her. One evening, as she was adjusting his IV, a whisper brushed past her ear. Faint, almost like a breath. "Help me." Emily froze, her heart slamming against her chest. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone behind her. But there was no one, just Mr. Holloway, lying still as always. Had she imagined it? Was exhaustion making her hear things? But as she stared into his unblinking eyes, a chill ran down her spine. What if he wasn't just a man in a vegetative state? What if he was trapped and trying to tell her something? Emily barely slept that night. She kept replaying the whisper in her head, convincing herself it had to be her imagination. Maybe it was just the stress of starting a new job, the eeriness of the mansion, or the loneliness that seemed to linger in every hallway. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The next morning, as she prepared Mr. Holloway's medications, she found herself studying his face more closely. His eyes remained dull, unmoving, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something beneath them, a silent plea, an urgency that his body couldn't express. At breakfast, she sat in the kitchen with the housekeeper, Mrs. Alvarez, a woman in her late 50s, with tired eyes and a kind face. She had been working in the Holloway household for years, and if anyone knew what was going on, it would be her. Mrs. Alvarez, can I ask you something? Emily began, lowering her voice. About Mr. Holloway. Does he ever react to anything? Make sounds? The older woman stiffened, her spoon pausing over her bowl of oatmeal. She glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "You should just do your job, dear. Don't ask too many questions." Emily frowned. "So you have noticed something?" Mrs. Alvarez sighed, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the spoon down. "The last nurse, Amelia, she said she heard him too. Late at night, she swore he whispered her name." A cold shiver ran down Emily's spine. What happened to her? The housekeeper hesitated before answering. She left suddenly. Didn't even pack her things. Just walked out and never came back. Emily swallowed hard. The words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken fear. Over the next few days, she started paying closer attention. She noted the way the family barely acknowledged Mr. Holloway. His wife rarely entered the room, and when she did, it was only for a few minutes before she hurried away, as if she couldn't bear to look at him. Ethan, the son, never spoke about his father, and Claire, the teenage daughter, avoided the room altogether. Then there were the small, unsettling details, things only she seemed to notice. The way the medical charts were sometimes changed when she wasn't around, the strange bruises on Mr. Holloway's wrists, as if someone had grabbed him too hard, and the way the machines occasionally beeped in warning, though there was never anything wrong with them. One evening, as Emily was tidying up in the patient's room, Claire suddenly appeared at the doorway. The girl had always been distant, barely acknowledging Emily's presence, but tonight she looked different, nervous, almost desperate. "You shouldn't be here," Claire said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily turned to face her. "What do you mean?" Claire's eyes darted to her father, then back to Emily. "They don't want him to get better." A chill ran through Emily. Who doesn't? The girl opened her mouth as if to say something, but then quickly shut it. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and she tensed. Without another word, she turned and disappeared down the corridor. Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. What did Claire mean? Why would his own family not want him to recover? That night, she couldn't stop thinking about it. If Mr. Holloway was truly aware, trapped inside his own body, what had happened to put him in this state? And more importantly, who would want to keep him this way? The answer came in the most unexpected way. At around 2 a.m., Emily woke with a start. A sharp noise, like something falling, had echoed through the hallway. She got up, her heart pounding, and stepped into the corridor. The house was dark, silent, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. She hesitated for a moment, then decided to check on Mr. Holloway. As she entered his room, her breath caught in her throat. His eyes were wide open. And this time, there was no mistaking it. He was trying to move. His fingers twitched, barely noticeable, but it was enough. She rushed to his side, gripping his hand. "Mr. Holloway," she whispered. "Can you hear me?" A slow blink, barely a movement, but it was a response. Her heart pounded. He wasn't completely gone. He was still in there. But before she could react further, the door creaked open behind her. Emily turned sharply. Mrs. Holloway stood in the doorway, her expression cold and unreadable. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. Emily straightened, trying to steady her breathing. "I was just checking on him. She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Mrs. Holloway stepped forward, her presence commanding. "Your job is to keep him comfortable, nothing more." Emily held her gaze. "I think he's aware. I think he's trying to communicate." For the first time, she saw a flicker of something in Mrs. Holloway's expression, fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You're imagining things," she said, her voice firm. "Do not overstep your boundaries, Nurse Carter." And with that, she turned and left, the door clicking shut behind her. Emily let out a shaky breath. Her mind racing, something was very, very wrong in this house. And she was starting to fear that she was in danger too. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was getting too close to something she wasn't supposed to know. The way Mrs. Holloway had looked at her, the warning in her voice, told her one thing. She was right. Mr. Holloway was aware. And someone in this house didn't want that to be known. Over the next few days, Emily worked cautiously. She continued her duties as usual, but she paid closer attention. She checked Mr. Holloway's vitals more frequently, watched for any signs of movement, and most importantly, made sure no one noticed what she was doing. She didn't trust anyone, not even the other staff. One night, while the house was silent, she sat beside Mr. Holloway, determined to try something. She leaned in close and whispered, "If you can hear me, blink twice." For a long moment, nothing happened. Her heart sank. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe she was imagining things. Then, ever so slowly, he blinked. Once, then twice. Emily sucked in a sharp breath. He was responding. He was trapped inside his own body, unable to speak or move freely, but his mind was still awake. Her pulse raced as she grabbed a notepad and pen. "Okay," she whispered. "I'm going to ask you yes or no questions. Blink once for no, twice for yes." She steadied herself and asked the first question. "Are you in danger?" 2 blinks. Emily's stomach twisted. She swallowed hard. "Did someone do this to you?" 2 blinks. She could barely breathe. "Was it someone in this house?" 2 blinks. Her fingers trembled as she wrote down each answer. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this to him, and whoever it was, they were still here. Before she could ask more, a noise outside the door made her freeze. Footsteps. She quickly stuffed the notepad into her pocket and stood up just as the door swung open. Ethan Holloway stood there, his face pale, his eyes darting between her and his father. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice tense. Emily hesitated, unsure if she could trust him. But then she noticed something. The way he looked at his father, the way his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't just nervous, he was scared. "You already know, don't you?" she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed like he might deny it, but then he exhaled sharply. "I heard you last night. I saw the way he was looking at you. I know he's still in there." Emily took a step closer. "Ethan, I need to know the truth. What happened to him?" He looked toward the hallway, making sure no one was listening. then shut the door behind him. "It was my mother," he said, his voice low. "She did this to him." Emily's heart pounded. "Why?" Ethan swallowed hard. "My dad was going to change. His will. He found out some things about my mom. Things she didn't want anyone to know. He was planning to leave her with nothing. The night before his accident, they had a huge argument. The next morning, he was found unconscious in his office. The doctors said it was a stroke, but I don't believe that. And now, she's making sure he never recovers." Emily felt sick. It all made sense now. The coldness in Mrs. Holloway's eyes, the way she avoided the room, the strange changes in his medical records. She wasn't just waiting for her husband to fade away. She was making sure of it. "We have to do something," Emily said urgently. Ethan hesitated. "She'll know. If she finds out we're trying to help him, she won't let us. You don't know what she's capable of." Emily took his hand. "If we don't act now, he might never get another chance." Ethan nodded, his fear shifting into determination. That night, they put their plan into motion. Emily carefully adjusted Mr. Holloway's medication, making sure he was stable, while Ethan made a secret call to an old friend of his father, a lawyer who had been waiting for proof of foul play. Within hours, everything was set. The next morning, the house was in chaos. Police arrived, along with medical professionals who had been alerted about possible malpractice. Mrs. Holloway's calm facade finally cracked as she tried to deny everything. But the evidence was overwhelming. The lawyer presented the altered medical records, and Ethan gave his testimony. The truth was finally out. Mr. Holloway was transferred to a private facility where he could receive proper care. Away from the woman who had been keeping him in that state, Emily stayed by his side, helping with his recovery. And over the weeks, she saw more signs of improvement. His fingers started moving more. His expressions became clearer. And one evening, as she sat beside him, he managed to squeeze her hand. Tears filled Emily's eyes. He was fighting his way back. Ethan took over his father's business, cutting ties with his mother completely. Mrs. Holloway faced legal consequences. But more than that, she lost everything she had tried to protect. The money, the power, it all slipped through her fingers. One night, as Emily sat by Mr. Holloway's side, she whispered, "You're going to be okay now." And for the first time, he blinked. Once, a single deliberate blink, a thank you. And with that, Emily finally knew she had done the right thing.